graphics lesson. Now get 2 free games with TurboGrafx for only $69.99.
CGQ Plus.
All right, so today we're going to try something a little bit different. This is an idea that I got for a video for this channel at least a year ago. I've got some index cards here where I made all my notes, and I made these at least a year ago, and they've just been sitting around because I just never got around to making it. Just to give credit where credit is due, I got the idea for this from watching a BitHead video where he just talked about, I guess, sort of the whole concept of top 10 lists. This wasn't the topic of the video, it was an offhand comment that he made. But he was talking about how people's top 10 lists are relatively boring because they all look so similar. And I think the reason for that is that when anybody decides, oh, I'm going to make a top 10 list that I'm going to put out there, like I'm going to make a YouTube video or a blog post, and I'm going to say this is my top 10 or top 20 or top 25 games for whatever system, there are so many games that you're sort of obliged to put on that list, even if you maybe personally don't like that game that much. You know, like as an example for me, Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, it's a great game. Is it for me a top 10 Super Nintendo game? Not top 10 best, like I'm trying to say, like objectively, like that's a thing. These are the top 10, you know, best games in the system. But like my top 10 favorite games, Link to the Past would definitely not be on there. But if you look on anybody's top list of Super Nintendo games, it'll be in almost everybody's top 5. And I think if you don't put it there, you're going to have people going crazy in the comment section about how you know, you have no taste in video games. But so it kind of gave me the idea, because, you know, based on what BitHead said, that like, well, what if instead of talking about your top whatever, like it would depend on the size of the system's library, right? But like for the TurboGrafx-16, there were 90 something, I want to say it was 94, North American TurboGrafx-16 turbo chip or HuCard games. So the top 10 of that is more than 10% of the libraries. That's quite a bit. But if you're talking about like the PlayStation 2 or something, I mean, that had over 1,000 games, right? So the top 10 games for the PlayStation 2 is a very tiny fraction. So my idea here was to get a sort of semi-definitive top 10 list of TurboGrafx-16 games that I will read off to you. And then I'm going to talk about what my next 10 games would be. So, you know, not like hidden gems or something, but, you know, maybe games that are my personal favorites on the system that I think people don't talk about, or games that I think should be on the top 10 list that ostensibly the majority don't think should be there. So yeah. And, you know, I've kind of told this story, I guess, piecemeal before. It's not even really a story, but just sort of my brief history with the TurboGrafx-16. I did not grow up with a TurboGrafx-16. I had a Sega Genesis and I had a PC. I got my first TurboGrafx-16 in 2003 or 2004. I traded somebody straight up. I had an Atari Jaguar that wasn't brand new, but I bought it brand new and only played it a few times and put it back in the box. So it was, you know, next door to brand new. And I traded somebody straight up for a boxed TurboGrafx-16 that, you know, came with, like, you know, I gave the guy the Jaguar that came with Cybermorph. He gave me the TurboGrafx-16 that came with Keith Courage. Because at the time, you know, because I've mentioned this story before and people always say, oh, you got a really good deal. And yeah, you know, with hindsight, I got a really good deal. But at the time, that was a very fair trade. And I think I had that TurboGrafx for about 4 years. You know, I kind of slowly built up a small library of games for it. Then I ended up selling it off. I mean, I've talked about that before too. I had my great video game purge of 2008 and I sold off a lot of my stuff. And unfortunately the TurboGrafx went with it. But I think I only was without one for about a year. And I decided that was a pretty stupid thing to do, selling my TurboGrafx-16. So I bought another one. And this was before prices started going crazy. So I was able to build up a complete library of what I had before, and was able to add a bunch of new games to it as well. And then back then, this was before the Turbo EverDrive was a thing. But I had some other kind of device, and I can't remember what it was called. But some of you guys might remember, like before we had like the SD card based flash cartridges, there were these other cartridges you could get that you would hook straight up to your computer, like through the serial port or even sometimes through the parallel port. And you could literally load one game onto this cartridge and then stick it in your system, which, you know, sounds pretty primitive now, but at the time that was a step up because before that, like for the Super Nintendo, the only thing you could get is one of those super UFO devices that actually had a floppy disk drive in it. But I mean, anyway, we're getting off topic here. But so I had one of these things for the TurboGrafx-16 where it had like a loader that you plugged into your computer, and then it had a HuCard slot on it, and you would plug this thing into the unit, and you could copy one ROM onto the card, and then you could play that game, which at the time was cool because you could also load PC Engine games onto it, and I think it automatically would know that it was a PC Engine game and would swap the pins as needed, you know, electronically or whatever, so that you could still play that on an American TurboGrafx-16. But that was pretty awesome, and I was very lucky that you know, sometimes people see my TurboGrafx collection in the background of one of my videos or something, and you know, they'll make some comment about how like, oh, that's a nice collection. But, you know, I got very lucky that I bought most of those games when they were still pretty cheap. Like some of my games, like the really common ones, like Power Golf or World Class Baseball, you know, I bought those for literally a few dollars and they were still brand new and sealed. So it was just a different time back then. But anyway, I was a member of these forums called the PC Engine FX forums, which those forums are still online so that you can go look at them, but the owner sort of closed them so that you can't post, you can't create a new account, but everything is still there. But in its prime, that was sort of like the main place to go talk about TurboGrafx and PC Engine games. And they have a thread over there that is sort of like the aggregate, I want to say top 25 TurboGrafx-16 games, like American TurboGrafx-16 HuCard games. And so what the guy did that started the thread was he would just ask people to post their top 10 lists. And then he would assign each game a score based on where you put it on your top 10 list. And so he was giving these games aggregate scores by adding them together and creating like a master top 25 list of any forum member or of all of the forum members that chose to submit a list. So this is sort of a crowdsourced top 10 list. And I mean, there must have been at least 30 people that contributed to this. So this isn't just like 3 or 4 guys. So this is not my personal top 10 list. This is probably not going to match up with any other top 10 list that you would see, just because everybody's list is going to be different. But like I said, this, if you want to consider this, you know, to use a BitHeadism, if you want to consider this the definitive list, you know, it's the list based on the opinion of a lot of people, rightly or wrongly. So the premise, as I said in this video, is I'm going to read off all these games to you, this top 10 list, or in this case, it's a top 11 list, and I'll explain why in a minute. And then I made my own list of numbers 12 through 20. And yeah, so I'll briefly talk about my feelings about their top 10 list and whether or not I agree with it. And then we're going to get into the 9 additional games that I chose. And if you guys think this is a cool idea, format wise for a video, I could see doing something similar for other consoles. So I said it's a top 11 list. And the reason for that is that there's a tie at number 10. Like, so these 2 games both got the same aggregate score. So there's nothing I can really do about that. If there was a tie anywhere else, I could just kick off number 10 and we'd still have a top 10 list with just a tie at one of the positions. But because the tie is at number 10, we just have a top 11 list. So I'm going to try to go through these fairly quickly just because these aren't really the games that I wanted to talk about. So at number 10, the two games that are tied, both of these games I think deserve to be higher. One a little bit higher and the other one a lot higher. First, you have Military Madness, which Military Madness is like a hex grid based strategy game. And when we think of that kind of game, I think we mostly think of PC games. But most home consoles had at least a few of these hex grid strategy games. But I think Military Madness is a little bit more approachable than your average strategy game of this ilk. And, you know, I mean, clearly it's on the top 10 list, so a lot of TurboGrafx gamers appreciate the game. So, I mean, if anybody's watching this video, if you've never checked it out, if it's maybe a little bit intimidating, you know, because it's a hex grid-based strategy game, you should definitely give it a shot. I think it's the kind of game, it's not a pick up and play, I'm going to fire up my TurboGrafx for 10 minutes and play a game kind of game. Like, you know, but especially these days with the pandemic going on, you know, if you're sitting around at home and maybe you're getting a little bit bored and you want the kind of game that you can just kind of sit down and burn some time playing, check out Military Madness. And that was kind of the second thing I was going to say about the whole flashcard thing is, you know, these days, you know, back when I first started playing TurboGrafx, you know, if you wanted to play a game on actual hardware or with decent emulation, you didn't have a lot of choices. Obviously, you could buy the game or you could track down one of these weird flashcard devices I was telling you about. Or like, I think the only emulator I know about for the TurboGrafx back then was an emulator that you actually had to pay for. But, you know, these days with like RetroArch and OpenEmu or Raspberry Pis, Misters, you know, the TurboGrafx Mini, if we're ever going to get that, there's no excuse, financially speaking, for not being able to play these games. And even if you don't have the kind of money to drop on a Raspberry Pi or a Mister, you know, things like RetroArch and OpenEmu are free, and all you need is some kind of USB controller. Anyway, the other game that is tied at number 10 is Dungeon Explorer. And I'm very surprised to see it all the way down at number 10, especially considering some of the games that are above it, where I would push those further down the list. Dungeon Explorer, there are a few games on the TurboGrafx-16, I think, that they have a reputation, undeservedly, of being rip-offs of other games. And I even made some comment about that when I did my TurboGrafx-16 launch video. I think I said, people who like to repeat things they hear other people say will accuse Dungeon Explorer of being a Gauntlet ripoff, which Dungeon Explorer has nothing to do with Gauntlet. They're two very, very different games. The only way in which they're similar is that the enemies have these little spawn points that you can destroy. In that sense, and the fact that it's overhead, okay, in that way it's similar to Gauntlet, but that's the only way the two games are similar. Dungeon Explorer is really more of an action RPG, except that unlike a game like Legend of Zelda, when you start the game, you can pick what sort of character class your character is, whether that's like a fighter or like a wizard or a bard, etc., etc. I think there are 8 different character classes that you can choose from. Some of those lend themselves well to single-player play. Other classes are really only good if you're going to play as part of a party, which gets me into the second reason that Dungeon Explorer is awesome, and that's that you can play up to 5 players simultaneously using the Turbo Tap, which I've never gotten to play Dungeon Explorer multiplayer, but that sounds awesome. It's sort of an open world kind of game like The Legend of Zelda, and there are different like dungeons you have to go into, fight your way through, and defeat a boss. But again, it's the kind of game you can't really pick up Dungeon Explorer and just play it for a few minutes. You know, like The Legend of Zelda, you need to really sit down and put some time into the game, although it does have a password-based, if you want to call it a save system or a continue system. So it's not like you have to try to beat the whole game in one sitting. But for me, Dungeon Explorer is easily a top 5 TurboGrafx-16 game, maybe even top 3. Number 9 is Devil's Crush. And Devil's Crush is one of 3 pinball games on the TurboGrafx-16. Devil's Crush and sort of its little brother Alien Crush are both very similar. They were actually developed by Compile, who we normally think of as a shooter developer. Both of them are sort of these fantastical style games that are not even trying to simulate a real table, but, you know, rather to create the kind of game that could never exist in real life, which I think is very, very cool. I'll just say right now that I don't have Alien Crush anywhere on my list, just because to me, in some ways, they're like, those 2 games are like 2 sides of the same coin. Devil's Crush is the better of the 2 games. I think that the gameplay is a little bit better, but it's also got the scrolling screen instead of the screen that flips back and forth. That doesn't really bother me, but that really bothers some people for some reason. But it is a really cool game. It's the kind of game you can pick up pretty cheap, so that's pretty cool. Number 8 is Splatterhouse. And, you know, everybody loves Splatterhouse, and I just got done on a read-through talking about Splatterhouse 3, which I think is the best game in the series. The first Splatterhouse, this is the kind of game, and there'll be a few games on this list where I'll say something similar. Splatterhouse is the kind of game where the value that it brings to the table is really like attitude and atmosphere. You know, like the cool thing about Splatterhouse is the fact that it's like bloody and gory and disgusting, and your character has the Jason mask. Gameplay wise, the game is good, but it's not great. Like if you took away the blood and the gore, and instead of being in a haunted house, it was just in some castle, and you were just some regular looking guy trying to save a princess, nobody would be talking about Splatterhouse. So it's a good game, but I don't think it's a top 10 game. Number 7 is Nutopia. And, you know, everything I was saying about Dungeon Explorer and Gauntlet and how that's an unfair comparison. Everybody compares Nutopia to The Legend of Zelda, and that is a very fair comparison. It's a very blatant, if you want to say ripoff, I mean, I don't consider it a rip. You know, most games, it's like any popular media, like most things are a derivative of other things. But Nutopia is pretty blatant in that regard. But, you know, if you were growing up and you didn't have an NES, but you did end up getting a TurboGrafx, it gave you the opportunity to play a Zelda-style game. And Nutopia is a very, very good game. Like, it's a ripoff, but it's a very good ripoff. And that's pretty much what everybody says about it. Number 6 is Bonk's Adventure. And, you know, everybody loves the Bonks games, and they are very good games. The first game, you know, I mean, obviously it's the first game, so it has that going for it. It's probably the game that most people have played versus the second and the third. You know, at one point, Bonk had sort of become the de facto mascot, if you will, you know, character-based mascot for the TurboGrafx-16. And they're cool games. I just think the first game really isn't all that great. And it's the kind of game where I think the more you play it, the more you see its flaws. Like, I think it's got sort of like, you know, boring, repetitive, uninspired level design, a lot of it. You know, but it comes out of the gate strong. Like, some of the first few levels I think are like the best levels in the game. You know, like the volcanoes that are rising up out of the ground, or when you bonk that dinosaur on the head. Like, you didn't realize playing through the level that you were actually on the back of this big dinosaur, and then you get to the head of the dinosaur and you bonk him on the head and he opens his mouth and you go in, and then you're you know, playing through the dinosaur's guts. Like, that's very, very cool. But I just feel like, you know, it's a game that sort of like puts all its cards on the table too early. So the deeper you get into the game, it starts to become a little bit boring and repetitive. So is it the number 6 game on the TurboGrafx? Probably not, in my opinion. Number 5 is Bomberman 93. There's really no debating that Bomberman 93 is the best. Well, there only were, what, 2 Bomberman games on the TurboGrafx-16, and it's better than the original Bomberman. I'm not really in a position to comment too much on Bomberman. I've never gotten that much into the game, But, you know, I feel like Bomberman's real strength is in its multiplayer play, and I've never gotten to play the game multiplayer. So, like, I would love the opportunity to do that at some point. But I've only played the game single player, and single player, the game is just kind of like, you know, I could take it or leave it. Number 4 is Ninja Spirit. And, again, I like Ninja Spirit a lot. It was one of the first games that I ever got for my system, and I played it quite a bit, and I really had fun with it. It's got excellent atmosphere. It's got cool music. Even the sound effects I really like in Ninja Spirit. I think putting it at number 4 is way too high. I don't think it's a top 10 game, really, on the system. But it is a very, very cool game. It's an IRM game. I don't know how many people know that. You know, when you think of IRM, you think of, you know, R-Type or Image Fight. But they made Ninja Spirit, and Ninja Spirit was an arcade game before it was on the TurboGrafx and PC Engine. Number 3 is Blazing Lasers. You know, it was a launch game, so first of all, you know, I just say that, you know, for a launch game, it was very impressive. I think Blazing Lasers, if I'm not mistaken, was the pack-in game if you bought a TurboGrafx-16 in PAL territory. So that would be kind of cool, I guess. It was a compile game, you know, much like the Crush series. So that's more of what you think of when you think of compile, is games like Blazing Lasers. It would be in my top 20, it wouldn't be in my top 10, and more importantly, it's not the best vertically scrolling shooter on the TurboGrafx-16. And so for it to be the 3rd best game overall on this list for me is a little bit surprising. Again, it's a very, very good game. I really don't have any criticism to really level at Blazing Lasers. I just think that there's another game that we'll get to when we get to my list on the TurboGrafx that is the clearly superior vertically scrolling shooter. Speaking of which, at number 2, they have Air Zonk. And listen, I like Air Zonk very much. It's a very cool game. It's a very fun game. It's probably got more personality, sort of more kitschiness than almost any other game I've ever played. You know, one of the reasons that you would never get bored playing that game is there's always something seemingly new to see, like new power-ups or new crazy-looking enemies, weird weapons. It's a very, very entertaining game. But its strengths purely as a shooting game, to me, are you know, not top tier. Like, as somebody, like, I like traditional shooters, and Air Zonk is certainly not that. Like, I don't really like, for the most part, these cartoony shooters. As far as cartoony shooters go, Air Zonk is a very good one. But, you know, like the Parodius Da or Star Parodier, you know, it's the same thing. They're fun games that have a lot of personality, but they're not the games that I really go to, because if I want to play a shooting game, I want to play a shooting game. I don't want to play like a cartoon. So, but that's not to say that my issue with the game is with the graphics, because it's not. Like, the game looks really cool. I just think that in some ways the game is like, it wouldn't be fair to say that it's all hat and no cattle, but it's a lot of hat and not as many cattle, if that makes sense. And then number 1, again, this would not be my number 1 game on the system, but it's a very, very good game. Bonk's Revenge. Bonk's Revenge certainly is the best Bonk game on the system. I'll give it that. If you're somebody that's never played a Bonk game before, and you're not someone that's gonna, like, I want to track down all 3 of them and play them all. If you're gonna play one, play Bonk's Revenge, because it's the best one of the 3. Is it the best game on the TurboGrafx-16? I personally wouldn't go that far, but certainly it belongs on a top 10 list, if not a top 5. So that is the top 11 TurboGrafx-16 games, according to the collective user base of the PC Engine FX forums. And I'll only say this, I guess, because at some point we are getting the TurboGrafx-16 Mini. All of the games I just mentioned, except for Devil's Crush, except for Devil's Crush, are all on the TurboGrafx-16 Mini. Bonk's Adventure, for some reason, only the Japanese version is on there, so PC Genjin, but it's the same game. So, so there you go. So now we're going to get into my 12 through 20. So what is that? I got 9 games here to talk about. And some of these games, if I was making my own top 10 list, some of these games would be on that top 10 list. Other of these games, I'm perfectly happy having them be between 10 and 20. I'm not going to count backwards like we did there. I'm just going to start with number 12 because, you know, I'm not trying to build up to some sort of exciting ending here. So my number 12 game, you know, I mentioned that Blazing Lasers was not, in my opinion, the best vertically scrolling shooter on the TurboGrafx, and that's because Soldier Blade is. And Soldier Blade, for me, if I was making a top, I don't know, top 3 list, I guess, for me, Soldier Blade would be probably a top 3 game. I think Dungeon Explorer and Soldier Blade would probably be 2 of my 3 top 3 TurboGrafx-16 games. It's the last game in the Soldier series, as people call it, that started off with Star Soldier on the NES and Famicom. I think it was also an MSX game. And then you got Superstar Soldier on the PC Engine and TurboGrafx. Then you got Final Soldier, and then Soldier Blade was the last game, I believe, in the series. So I don't know why Final Soldier was not the final game, but whatever. Unfortunately, it's a very expensive game if you want to own a copy physically. But for reasons I already talked about, why do you really feel the need to own a physical copy? It's a vertically scrolling shooter, as I said. The game's got like no slowdown at all. It's got great graphics, wonderful music, but just the controls are spot on in that game. I probably play Soldier Blade more than any other TurboGrafx-16 game. This is the kind of game, even if you're only going to play for 5 minutes, like you're waiting, for your wife to get ready because you're going to go somewhere. You got 5 minutes to kill. Just, blast to the first level of the game and shut it off. Or if you want to, sit down and play for a little bit longer, Soldier Blade's the kind of game where it's not so hard that, you're not going to get game over too quickly. You can make it easily into the 3rd or 4th level, or operations as the game calls it. So, you can easily burn 20 or 30 minutes playing the game, even if you're not that good of a shooter gamer. So yeah, one of my absolute favorite games on the system. Number 13. So I guess I'm going to qualify what I'm going to say about number 13 real quick. I just want to kind of reiterate that, unlike, BitHead likes to talk about his, definitive lists. This is not a definitive list. It's just, this is the list of my favorite games, not what I necessarily think are the best games. And what I mean by that is that at number 13, I have the Legendary Axe. Legendary Axe, I have a lot of nostalgia for that game. When I got my first RGB monitor, I had to RGB mod. Well, I didn't even really RGB mod my TurboGrafx. I made an external device that I actually had to hook up to the appropriate pins on the expansion port of my TurboGrafx. And then I had, that it was on a breadboard, if anybody knows what that is. And then I had like a connector coming out of the breadboard that I could hook into a video cable that went to my RGB monitor. And the Legendary Axe was like the first TurboGrafx-16 game that I ever saw in RGB. So, I mean, it just reminds me of good times playing that game. But I also think it's a very good game. I've said many times, I think the Legendary Axe should have been the pack-in game for the TurboGrafx-16. Not because I think it's like such an awesome game that it deserves to be the pack-in, but I think it would have been a good game to be a pack-in game. I think it's a good showcase game for the early days of the TurboGrafx. Like in some ways, it almost seems like the quintessential TurboGrafx-16 game to me. Just in terms of the graphics, the colorful, detailed graphics. It's got, these TurboGrafx chiptunes that just sounds like signature, TurboGrafx and PC Engine music. The controls of the game are good, not great. The game is too hard, I think, as you get along. The third level is when the game starts kind of getting frustrating. And the reason that I say that this is my list of personal favorites and not some sort of objective list is that, you know, Legendary Axe 2, which was also a TurboGrafx-16 game, is better than the first game. Although I would say that the first Legendary Axe is a little bit too difficult, and the second Legendary Axe is a little bit too easy. But they're both really cool games. But if I was trying to make some sort of like, these are the best quality games, then I would have to rate Legendary Axe 2 a little bit higher. All right. Number 14. So, you know, one of the cool things about having this sort of next 10 list is that it's supposed to free me up from talking about, you know, the obligatory games. And the fact that this game didn't make the PC Engine FX top 10 list is pretty shocking, because if Soldier Blade is the best vertically scrolling shooter on the system, the best horizontally scrolling shooter by a country mile is R-Type. And so the fact that that didn't make the top 10 list, I don't really get that at all. I don't even really know what to say about R-Type that hasn't been said already. It's just an excellent game. I talked about it extensively in my TurboGrafx-16 in 1989 video. So, I mean, you can go watch that if you want. It's a very difficult game, but it's the kind of game that's difficult in a way that never feels, in my opinion, unfair. It's like every time, and I said this in that video, but like every time I died, I kind of knew, oh, okay, you can't be right here at this part. You need to go up here, or this guy's going to pop out here and you got to kill him, or you always kind of know what you did wrong. Like, okay, next time through, I need to do this instead of doing that. And sort of the key with R-Type is it's like a bunch of different moments of you doing that and realizing, okay, this is how you get past this part. And like, you know, one of the levels, I don't remember which level, I want to say it's level 3, but I'm not sure. The whole level is you fighting this gigantic ship that's way bigger than the screen. Like, you start off behind the ship, you come up to the back of the ship, and you have to start working your way all the way around the ship to destroy it. And I can't even tell you how many times I had to play that level before I beat it. But it was just like every single time I died, I learned something. You know, okay, I gotta do this, I gotta not do that. You want this power up here, not that power up. And so while it's hard, I was never frustrated by it. And I just love it. It's also probably the best home version of the game from that era. I mean, these days you can get an arcade perfect home version of the game, I'm sure. But at the time, what the game was out on the Sega Master System. But I mean, what else was it on at home? I feel like I'm missing something else. But yeah, it was a great version of the game. And I've talked about this, and it's kind of common knowledge. But in Japan, R-Type had to come on 2 hue cards because the game was bigger than whatever the standard ROM size was for a hue card. But by the time the game came out here, NEC had doubled the size of the available ROM size for turbo chips. So when the game came out here, they were able to release the entire game on a single hue card. All right. Number 15 might not be a game that many people would expect to see on the list, but this is a game that's really, really underappreciated on the TurboGrafx-16. This is a Taito game that started out in the arcade and then came out on both the TurboGrafx-16 and the Sega Genesis. But the TurboGrafx-16 has by far the better version. And that is Kadesh. And it's funny because, you know, most people don't really talk about Kadesh that much, but I remember that on the PC Engine FX forums, it was a well-regarded game. If anybody ever asked about Kadesh, you know, most people would chime in and say, oh yeah, that's a good game. And I got very lucky. I got my copy of Kadesh, I think on the same day that I got my second TurboGrafx-16, so in like 2009. And at the time, you know, it was like, oh, this is kind of a pricier game. I think I had to pay like 25 bucks for it, you know, and it was complete. Well, complete in that it came in the jewel case with the manual. I know complete means that it has the outer box with the styrofoam, but, you know, I don't care about that kind of stuff. But Kadesh, so Kadesh is like a side-scrolling action I guess if you want to call it an action platformer, it doesn't really play like a platformer, I don't think. But it's got like RPG elements. Like you gain, you don't see your experience points, but you gain experience points every time you kill an enemy, and eventually you level up. And when you level up, your maximum hit points goes up. And then if you are the wizard, you learn a new spell. You don't learn a new spell every time you level up, but like maybe every other time or something. Like the wizard has offensive magic. And there are 4 different players that you can play as in Kadesh. There's I want to say it's a fighter, a mage, a priest, and a ninja. I think if you get the Genesis version, there's only, I think it's only the fighter and the mage, maybe. So, you know, the graphics aren't as good if you play on the Genesis. I should mention, the game came out on the TurboGrafx-16 because of working designs. You know, obviously it was a PC Engine game, and it was working designs that stepped up and brought it over to the TurboGrafx-16. I think some people get turned off to Kadesh because it's very hard at the beginning. So there's no continues. If you die, it's just game over and start over, you know, sad day for you. But I'd say, like, if you got to the first boss and maybe you had almost no hit points left or something like that, you might as well reset the game. But because there's no way for you to go back. If you're like halfway through the first level and you've taken too much damage, there's nowhere for you to go and refill your health. But like after you beat the first boss, you go through a little bit of extra area and you end up in this new town where there's an inn, and you can stay at the inn and then you get your hit points refilled. So at that point, if you want to, you can even start grinding and leveling up, because as your hit points get depleted, you can just go hit up the inn. But you also get money on top of the experience points, and you go to shops and you know, you buy new equipment. So that's why it has sort of light RPG elements, if you want to say that. But you know, it's just a side-scrolling action game. So it'd be like playing like Popful Mail or something like that. Or isn't Battle for Olympus kind of like that too? But it's got really cool graphics. It's got great music, and so you know, give Kadesh a chance. But, you know, don't turn it off just because at the beginning it just seems like, oh, it's too hard. Because the game actually gets easier once you can power up your guy a little bit. All right, number 16. You know, I kind of really vacillated on whether or not I wanted to include this on my list. But to me, there's just no debating that it's a top 20 game. And that's Galaga 90. Or Galaga 90. Or Galaga 90. You know, when I was growing up, you know, I liked playing Galaga in the arcade. It's a very cool game. And, you know, this reimagining of the game, they did something similar with Space Invaders, but somehow it just wasn't quite as cool. You know, what they did with Galaga 90 or Galaga 88, if you play it on the PC Engine, you know, when the game starts off, it still has the same, you know, sort of single board style that you're used to. But I think after you clear 3 boards, it turns into more of a traditional vertically scrolling shooter where it's actually scrolling. There's dudes coming down. There's boss battles. The game's got very simple graphics, but they're like very clean graphics. Like it looks really, you don't look at it and think, oh, this looks kind of boring. It just looks very clean. And the game controls really well. You know, when I was first getting into the TurboGrafx-16 and just playing on emulators, you know, 15 years ago, before I got, well, so I guess more than 15 years ago, when I got my first TurboGrafx, it was the kind of game that would come up over and over again on lists of games that were, you know, recommended that you play. So definitely a game to check out. Moving on to number 17. So number 17, this is another game that constantly gets erroneously compared to another game. And it really annoys me because it's the same thing. If people are just parroting what they hear other people say. And just like Dungeon Explorer, I just don't understand the comparison. And that's Bloody Wolf. Bloody Wolf is always compared to Contra. Oh, that's just the TurboGrafx-16 version of Contra. And the game has nothing to do with Contra. I don't understand. If you were going to compare Bloody Wolf to anything, it would be like Rambo 3 on on the Sega Genesis, and even that's not really that fair of a comparison. It is for the most part side-scrolling, but like a good beat 'em up, you also have sort of that Z-axis movement as well. You can't play the game two-player, that kind of sucks. But like, I mean, you can ride motorcycles. It's a really, really cool game. It's just more of it's like a side-scrolling-ish run-and-gun game, but any direct comparison to Contra, I just don't agree with at all. So now we're down to my last three games, my 18, 19, and 20. And these might be a little bit more, I don't know, controversial. But again, I'm talking about my favorite games here, not what I think are the top 20 best quality games. So at number 18, I've got World Class Baseball, which is the only sports game on the list. You know, I mean, I just got done saying this, I guess, in that magazine read-through I just did. But, you know, for the most part, in my opinion, the 16-bit era didn't really have a lot going on as far as baseball games go. Like, I would much rather play NES baseball games than almost any 16-bit baseball game. Like, Tommy Lasorda baseball is good, Sports Talk baseball is good, but like for me, I would rather play the NES version of Baseball Stars 2 or the first Baseball Stars. And for me, the best baseball games of the 16-bit era, for the most part, didn't make it out here in North America. And that's the Power League series on the PC Engine, the first of which was World Class Baseball. And, you know, it's funny, when I made that TurboGrafx-16 in 1989 video, I had so much fun. Probably my personal favorite part of that video is the segment on World Class Baseball, which is funny because I don't think it was a very popular segment. I always think when I make videos of like, oh, this is the spot where people are going to like turn off the video. And for sure that was the case there. I'm like, oh, people are going to be like, oh, he's talking about a sports game, and just turn it off. You know, in Japan, of course, Power League sort of ripped off the Japanese Professional Baseball League, NPB. You know, they had teams that sounded like they were the NPB teams, even though they weren't, which is, you know, developers did the same thing in North America who didn't want to pay licenses. But obviously it wouldn't have made much sense to release Power League Baseball here and maintain the same fake NPB team. So it's called World Class Baseball because it's supposed to be teams from like around the world. But it's just a solid baseball game that plays a lot more like an 8-bit game, and maybe that's why I like it better. And then number 19, I'm sure this is going to be, you know, this will maybe raise a few eyebrows, but that's Turrican. And I've talked about Turrican many times. Turrican is one of my personal favorite games. I think it's a misunderstood game by a lot of people who don't really know how to play it properly. But the TurboGrafx-16 has a really good version of Turrican. It looks a lot more like the Amiga version of the game, which, at least for me, like, that's the definitive version of Turrican, is the Amiga version. The game started off on the Commodore 64, and on the 64 it's a little bit rough, but on the Amiga it's just a gorgeous game, and it plays very well. And I first played this game on the Genesis, but on the Genesis the controls are really good. It really, having a 3-button controller is awesome. So in that sense the Amiga is not great, but the colors were really washed out, and the music was okay. But the TurboGrafx-16 version visually looks a lot more like the Amiga version. It looks a lot more colorful. It's a cool game. It's a cool version of the game, I should say. And then the last one on the list, number 20, is this is one of my favorite platformers. To me, it's like, if you have maybe, you know, Bonk's Revenge is clearly the best platformer on the TurboGrafx-16. This might be, in my opinion, the second best platformer, and that's New Adventure Island. And, you know, I think the levels are a little bit cooler, in my opinion, than like Bonk's Adventure. I've already talked about, you know, the history of Adventure Island versus the Wonder Boy series, so I'm not going to go over that again. But the game is incredibly colorful looking. It's got really cool music. You know, the gameplay mechanic with the Adventure Island games, where you have to keep eating fruit or it depletes your health, is weird, but it's not uncool. You can ride a skateboard. That's pretty cool. You can throw, what are those little hammers or like caveman axe looking things at people. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what else to say about New Adventure Island. If you're looking for a platform game to play on the TurboGrafx, I personally highly recommend it. That's my 20th game. So, you know, like I said, a lot of these games for me would be in the top 10. Certainly Soldier Blade is a top 10. R-Type is a top 10. Maybe Galaga 90. Maybe Bloody Wolf. And just, you know, a lot of the games that are in the top 10 would still be in my top 10, but maybe not as high. But like I would take out Blazing Lasers and Bonk's Adventure and Splatterhouse and Devil's Crush. And that way Military Madness and Dungeon Explorer wouldn't have to be tied. And then the three that I would put in there, like I said, Soldier Blade, R-Type, maybe Galaga 90, maybe the Legendary Axe. I don't know. Again, it depends if it's an objective or subjective list. Anyway, that was my idea for the next 10. Let me know what you guys think. You can let me know what you think of my list. You can let me know what you think of the PC Engine effects list. I don't know. Do whatever you want to do. Let me know if you think this is a cool idea to do for other systems. And if so, then I'll think about doing that. That's going to do it for this episode of CGQ Plus. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.